In April of 1841, an announcement echoed through the plantations of South Carolina, one so unusual and scandalous that it rattled even the hardest hearts among the wealthy elite. Silas Ruddle, owner of Cypress Grove Plantation, declared that his only daughter, Catherine, would be placed under the complete authority of an enslaved man named Ezekiel Cross. This was not presented as a temporary arrangement, nor as an experiment in discipline or companionship. Silas did not call Ezekiel a caretaker, a nurse, or even a personal servant. Instead, he made it clear that his daughter, a 28-year-old woman weighed down by years of illness and medication, would live under Ezekiel's command as though he were her master. On paper, she was still his daughter and a white woman of status, but in every practical sense, Silas had reversed the hierarchy of their world. He had given his daughter to a man's society deemed less than human. The shock of this announcement cannot be overstated. The white families of Colleton County had built their entire system of wealth and power on a rigid racial order. For a plantation owner to announce that his daughter would be subject to the will of an enslaved man was unthinkable. It was more than scandal. It was a violation of everything the society pretended to hold sacred. Women of their class were supposed to be untouchable, preserved as symbols of purity, protected as though their fragility upheld the dignity of all white men. By placing Catherine under Ezekiel's authority, Silas seemed to declare her of less value than property. The whispers in Charleston parlors and Colleton County dining halls were merciless. Some wondered if the story was even true. Others speculated about what sort of madness, desperation, or hidden scheme had driven Silas to such an act. But the truth was far darker and more complicated than simple humiliation or eccentricity. The decision had its roots not only in family troubles, but in debts, secrets, and a network of men who cloaked themselves in ritual and cruelty. Before the year ended, Cypress Grove would be in ruins. 13 prominent men would lie dead, and Catherine's name would be remembered not with pity, but with a mixture of horror and awe. Yet to understand how this chain of events unfolded, one must step back into the humid, oppressive spring of 1841, when the rivers of the South moved slow as molasses, when the rice fields shimmered like silver mirrors under the weight of the sun, and when human misery was the foundation of prosperity. Colleton County lay low in the South Carolina landscape, a stretch of land marked by wide rivers, moss, draped oaks, and vast plantations carved into the marshland. The Comer River wound lazily through this country, its waters dark and sluggish, reflecting the hanging Spanish moss like funeral veils. On either side of its banks, rice paddies spread across thousands of acres, glistening with standing water that reached the knees of the enslaved men and women forced to work them from dawn to dusk. Day after day, under a punishing sun, they bent their backs to cultivate wealth for others, their own lives deemed expendable, their bodies broken in service of profits that enriched a small class of white landowners. Cypress Grove Plantation itself covered about 800 acres. Though a sizable estate by ordinary standards, it fell short of the grandeur possessed by the true aristocrats of the county. Silas Ruddle owned 58 enslaved people, enough to mark him as wealthy, but not enough to place him among the county's most powerful men. The great families of Colleton County boasted hundreds of enslaved laborers, thousands of acres, and influence that stretched from Charleston's glittering society to the lecture halls of northern universities. They were the families whose names opened doors, controlled banks, and shaped reputations. Silas, ambitious but insecure, longed for their acceptance. He yearned to step into their circles, to be counted among them, to shed the half-respect given to men who were prosperous but not powerful. His wife, Elizabeth Yancey, had brought him a respected surname and modest landholdings when they married in 1812, but her death in childbirth the following year left Silas to raise their daughter alone. Elizabeth had been practical, organized, and more interested in the plantation's profit margins than the games of social ambition that consumed her husband. Without her, Silas directed all his energy toward securing recognition among the county's elite. His obsession hollowed him. He grew tall and thin, his hair turning gray long before his time, his features severe as though carved from stone. To business associates, he was a man of cold bargains, reliable in his word but never generous in spirit. He lived less for joy than for the possibility of power. Catherine, his only child, grew up in a peculiar sort of isolation. She was educated by tutors, surrounded by books, but rarely allowed to form friendships beyond the household. By the time she reached adulthood, she was a woman adrift between worlds, neither accepted by the society around her nor fully independent within her own home. Doctors prescribed her medications for hysteria and female disorders, filling her body with chemicals that left her swollen, trembling, and dependent. At 28, she weighed nearly 260 pounds, her health fragile, her spirit volatile. Fits of anger and violence punctuated her days. In one such episode, she slashed her father's hand with a letter opener, leaving him scarred. Behind closed doors, neighbors whispered that she was mad, a shameful burden for a man as ambitious as Silas. Yet madness was not truly the right word for Catherine's condition. Beneath the symptoms of illness and instability lay memories of things no child should have witnessed. At 12 years old, Catherine had seen something in the cellar of Cypress Grove, something her father tried to erase from her mind through poison, intimidation, and years of manipulation. What she remembered was not delusion, but a truth so disturbing that society preferred to label her insane rather than confront it. The doctors, the medicines, the seclusion, all of it served to suppress her voice, to keep her silent. But silence never erased memory. This, then, was the fragile world into which Ezekiel cross-stepped in April of 1841. Silas had selected him, or rather had been instructed to select him, for a purpose. Officially, Ezekiel was brought in for Catherine's care, a man of supposed knowledge in herbal medicine, purchased from a Virginia plantation under mysterious circumstances. But his presence was no accident. His path to Cypress Grove had been deliberate, guided by his own thirst for justice, and by forces far larger than any one plantation. What began as a scandal whispered in drawing rooms would soon ignite into a chain of events that could not be stopped. The letter that arrived on April 7th changed everything. Silas had expected business correspondence, perhaps a notice about debts or land transactions, but instead, he found 3 pages sealed with red wax, bearing a symbol he recognized instantly, a scythe crossed with stalks of wheat, the unmistakable mark of the Brethren of the Harvest. This secretive order was not a rumor to Silas, but a reality he had lived within for nearly 2 decades. The Brethren consisted of 13 men bound together by rituals that combined remnants of old European traditions with practices stolen and twisted from the spiritual beliefs of enslaved people. They met in darkness, sacrificing blood to strengthen their land and their fortunes, convincing themselves that cruelty was not only natural but necessary. For 19 years, Silas had attended their gatherings, sometimes watching with unease, sometimes participating with cold determination, always reminding himself that this was the price of acceptance, the path to the higher social circle he craved. The letter was no simple message. It was a demand. Silas owed $12,000 in debts from failed investments and gambling losses, a ruinous sum that could only be paid by selling off his land and enslaved workers. To do so would destroy his standing entirely, leaving him humiliated and powerless. Yet the Brethren offered an alternative. He could demonstrate loyalty through a display of obedience, a sacrifice not of money but of pride. The letter ordered him to give his daughter, Catherine, into the absolute authority of one of his enslaved men for a full year. She would be under this man's control in every way that mattered: her health, her daily life, her very dignity handed over to someone society considered beneath her. On the surface, it would appear as though this were a medical experiment, a desperate measure for a sick woman, but in truth, it was a test, a way for Silas to prove he valued the brotherhood and his place within it more than his own blood. The humiliation would be immense. White society prided itself on protecting its daughters, but Silas was commanded to do the opposite, to lower Catherine beneath his property and make her a symbol of submission. If he agreed, his debts would vanish, his fortune restored, his place among the county's leaders secured. Silas sat in his study that night staring at the letter, the candlelight flickering across his face as he considered the impossible choice. Bankruptcy would end him, and resistance against the brethren was unthinkable. Their members were judges, bankers, preachers, men who could erase him with a word. They could ruin him, even kill him, without consequence. There was only one real choice, and society had already trained him to make it: sacrifice his daughter's dignity to preserve his own power. Before dawn, he wrote his acceptance. 3 days later, a second letter arrived. It named the man chosen for Catherine, Ezekiel Cross, 33 years old, skilled in carpentry and herbal medicine, purchased from Virginia and transferred through intermediaries until he arrived at Cypress Grove. The letter described him as quiet and obedient, though that was a lie carefully chosen for Silas's benefit. In truth, Ezekiel had not been brought here by chance. He had maneuvered his way south, deliberately allowing himself to be sold from plantation to plantation, gathering whispers and fragments of knowledge about the brethren until he positioned himself at the very doorstep of the man responsible for his greatest loss. For behind Ezekiel's calm eyes was a grief and rage that had burned for years. His wife Sarah, his son Benjamin, and his daughter Ruth had been torn from him 3 years before, sold to a plantation in Alabama infamous for its cruelty, where they each died within months. The one who had ordered that sale, splitting the family for no reason but to prove his ruthless loyalty to the brethren, was none other than Silas Ruddled. Ezekiel had learned of it, and he had waited, patient as stone, until this moment. On April 13th, he arrived at Cypress Grove. When the wagon pulled up to the house, Silas stepped out onto the porch and looked upon the man who would be his daughter's keeper. What Silas saw unsettled him. Most enslaved people lowered their eyes in submission, but Ezekiel met his gaze directly, calm and unwavering. He stood tall, broad-shouldered, his frame hardened by years of labor, his skin unscarred by the lash, his hands strong yet precise, the hands of a craftsman. Silas spoke curtly, instructing him that Catherine was unwell and that his responsibility was her care. Ezekiel answered in a deep, steady voice, neither challenging nor submissive, claiming knowledge of herbal remedies passed from his grandmother. The transaction ended quickly, but the moment Ezekiel was alone in the small cabin near the main house, his composure shifted. He pulled from his shirt a cloth bundle, unwrapping it to reveal a scrap of paper on which 3 names were written in a child's hand: Sarah, Benjamin, Ruth. They were gone, taken by Silas's cruelty, and Ezekiel had sworn they would not be forgotten. For years, he had dreamed of this moment, of being close enough to his enemy to bring justice not through courts or law, but through careful, deliberate vengeance. Now he was here, inside Silas's world, trusted with the care of Catherine, given access to the very house where secrets festered. He knew that power was about to shift. He lay on the bed in that cabin, staring at the ceiling, planning step by step what he would do. He understood that sometimes the only way to destroy monsters was to become something monstrous yourself. The morning of April 14th marked the beginning of Ezekiel's true role at Cypress Grove, and though the sun rose brightly over the marshes, the atmosphere inside the plantation house was as heavy as ever. Judith, a middle-aged house servant with graying hair and tired eyes, guided him to the second floor where Catherine stayed secluded. She knocked lightly on the heavy wooden door, her voice cautious as she announced that a new caretaker had been brought to help with treatments. The reply from inside was immediate, a crash of something heavy thrown against the wall, followed by a slurred, venomous refusal. "I do not want more treatments. Send him away." Judith glanced at Ezekiel with sympathy, whispering that Catherine often had such days, then stepped back as he pushed open the door himself and entered, shutting it behind him. The room was suffocating, darkened by heavy curtains, the air thick with the scent of stale linens and the metallic tang of mercury from years of prescribed tonics. Scattered books, shattered glass, and rumpled clothing created a chaos that mirrored the mind of the woman who sat hunched in a chair by the cold fireplace. Catherine's hair was tangled, her face swollen and pale, her eyes unfocused yet sharp enough to study him with suspicion and rage. She spat words at him, claiming she needed no more doctors, no more poison disguised as medicine, no more false promises of help. But Ezekiel, calm and steady, replied softly that he was not a doctor, only a man asked to assist her, and that he came with no chains, no threats, no syringes of opium or mercury. His voice, measured and low, carried something different than what she was used to, neither dominance nor pity, but a careful respect that made her pause. She raged again, accusing him of being another tool of her father's cruelty, sent to silence her memory, to make her forget the things she had seen and dared to speak of. Yet when Ezekiel asked her, almost gently, what it was she was supposed to forget, the anger faltered. For a moment her eyes flickered with something more fragile, more human than madness. She studied him as though trying to decide if he could be trusted, then dismissed him with bitterness, declaring that everyone lied because truth was too dangerous. Still, when Ezekiel drew open the curtains and let sunlight pierce the gloom, her reaction betrayed her frailty. She shielded her face, weeping as the light revealed her weakness. He asked when she had last eaten properly, when she had last walked beyond this room. She whispered that she was too weak, that the doctors insisted the laudanum was necessary, that the medicine was the only thing keeping her alive. Ezekiel's reply was the first seed of rebellion he planted in her. What if the doctors are wrong? What if the medicine has been the poison all along? What if your father has been ensuring you never grow strong enough to speak of what you saw? Those words silenced her, breaking through years of gaslighting. She froze, her trembling hands stilled, her eyes wide with both terror and recognition. When she finally spoke, her voice carried a new clarity as she admitted that her father had told her nothing but that she had always suspected. Ezekiel did not claim to know everything, but he told her plainly that he had seen mercury poisoning before, that he knew what long-term laudanum dependence did to the body. He told her that a healthy woman did not become like this without someone deliberately ensuring it. Suspicion flared in her again, fear that he was testing her, tricking her into confessing something dangerous, but Ezekiel pressed gently, saying that he could help her recover, though it would not be easy and her father would not approve. He admitted that he had his own reasons for despising Silas, and when she asked, he told her the truth, that her father had sold away his wife and children, sending them to their deaths to prove loyalty to the brethren. Catherine listened, her face pale, but when she responded, it was with a bitter certainty. The brethren, he sold them for the brethren. That name, whispered in the gloom of the room, bound them together. She confessed her own hatred, her desire not only for her father's suffering, but for the suffering of every man who had taken part in the cellar rituals she had witnessed at 12. Her rage was sharp and focused, not madness, but memory transformed into vengeance. And in that moment, Ezekiel understood that Catherine was not merely a victim, nor simply an ally, but something darker, someone whose capacity for violence was as fierce as his own. She admitted she had killed before, house servants who might have exposed her lucid moments, deaths hidden beneath lies of escape. She warned him plainly that if he ever betrayed her, she would not hesitate to end him as well. Yet instead of recoiling, Ezekiel nodded, recognizing in her the same fire that burned within himself. They struck a pact then, a whispered conspiracy in a shuttered room. Ezekiel would strip her of the poisons that had been slowly killing her, guiding her through the agony of withdrawal with herbs, patience, and vigilance. In return, Catherine would remember everything with a clear mind, gathering her strength not to live peacefully, but to destroy those who had silenced her. She made one demand, that when their revenge was complete, he would help her end her life, for she could not bear to continue carrying the weight of memory. Ezekiel, knowing he was already too deep to turn back, agreed. Thus began their uneasy alliance, forged not in trust, but in a shared hunger for justice and ruin. Over the following days, he began reducing her laudanum, replacing it with tinctures of valerian, chamomile, and milk thistle. The process nearly broke her, 3 days of fever, vomiting, and agony, but he remained at her side, wiping her brow, holding the basin, speaking softly in the darkest hours, so she knew she was not abandoned. When at last the storm eased, Catherine was weaker than ever, but her mind was sharper, her speech clearer, her eyes less clouded. For the first time in years, she could focus on words on a page. He began walking her down the hallway in short steps, pushing her each day to go a little further, while also adjusting her diet to simple meats and vegetables instead of the heavy pastries she had relied on for comfort. Each step of recovery was a battle, but with every inch gained, Catherine became more dangerous to those who had once dismissed her as broken. They spoke often during these days. She told him what she had seen in the cellar as a child. The altar, the chanting, the blood, her father lifting a goblet to his lips, as though drinking evil itself. She described the years of manipulation that followed, the way he had convinced not only others but sometimes even herself that she was mad, that she had imagined it all. She revealed the coded journal she had kept hidden for years, documenting every strange sound, every visitor in the night, every absence of her father that coincided with whispers of horror. In turn, Ezekiel told her of Sarah, of Benjamin, of Ruth, painting them not as ghosts, but as vivid human beings whose loss could not be erased. Catherine listened, sometimes with sorrow, sometimes with fury, but always with the understanding that his pain and hers were different strands of the same rope, tightening around the same men. By the time Silas gathered the county's elite for the formal announcement at the end of April, Catherine and Ezekiel had already transformed. She sat at her father's side that night, her hands trembling beneath the table but her face calm, her smile small and perfect, the very picture of obedience. Ezekiel moved among the guests as a silent servant, pouring wine and clearing plates, listening to the whispers that drifted across the long dining room. When Silas rose to make his declaration that Ezekiel would henceforth have full authority over Catherine, gasps and murmurs swept through the crowd. Shock, disbelief, even disgust filled the air. But when all eyes turned to Catherine, she delivered the performance flawlessly, declaring that she trusted her father's decision, that she believed Ezekiel's care was helping her. To the guests, she seemed pliant, broken, perhaps resigned. But Ezekiel, watching from the shadows, saw the truth in the white of her knuckles and the glitter of her eyes. Beneath that quiet mask lay a storm, waiting for the right moment to break. May 14th arrived with the heavy stillness of summer, and with it came the chance Catherine and Ezekiel had been preparing for. Silas departed for Charleston early that morning, his carriage rolling down the long dirt road while the plantation slowly settled into its routines, unaware of the conspiracy unfolding in its heart. For 3 weeks, Catherine had grown stronger under Ezekiel's care, her body leaner, her steps steadier, her mind clear enough to cut through the fog that had smothered her for half her life. Each day she practiced walking farther, speaking with a sharpness that startled even herself, and writing pages upon pages from her hidden journal, translating the coded entries she had kept for years. She revealed to Ezekiel the breadth of the Brethren's reach, how the society extended beyond Colleton County into Charleston, Savannah, New Orleans, Richmond, always 13 men bound by rituals of blood, always cloaked in secrecy and power, always justifying cruelty as tradition. She described the cellar in greater detail, the altar where she had seen horrors at 12 years old, the secret chamber beyond the main room where her father had once mentioned a ledger that kept records of every gathering, every sacrifice, every member's involvement. Ezekiel listened with mounting dread and resolve. That ledger, if it existed, could expose them all, but retrieving it would mean stepping directly into the most dangerous place on the plantation. They agreed to act while Silas was away. On the night of May 14th, after the house had fallen into silence and the overseers retired to their quarters, Catherine, dressed in simple dark clothes, her hair tied back, her face grim with determination. Ezekiel carried a shuttered lantern as they moved quietly through the house to the kitchen, where behind the pantry shelves lay the disguised door to the cellar stairs. Catherine pressed a panel on the wall, and with a faint click the hidden entrance opened, revealing a steep descent into darkness. The smell struck them first, a foul mixture of damp earth, smoke, and something organic that carried the memory of rot. Catherine warned that the odor never left, no matter how often the room was cleaned. They descended carefully, the wood groaning beneath their weight, until they reached the bottom. The chamber opened wide before them, its packed dirt floor and stone walls glistening with moisture. At the center stood the altar, its surface stained dark with years of blood, its edges carved with grooves designed to catch what spilled. Robes with crimson trim hung on pegs, clay jars sealed with wax lined the walls, candle holders stood waiting, and scattered papers lay on shelves, some filled with strange diagrams, others with names and dates. Catherine guided him to the far wall where one stone seemed out of place. She pressed it, and with a low grind of hidden hinges, a section swung open, revealing the smaller secret chamber within. Here the ledger sat in full display, an enormous volume bound in dark leather with metal clasps, resting on a wooden stand as though it were sacred scripture. Around it stood shelves crowded with jars, boxes, and scrolls Ezekiel dared not examine too closely. He stepped forward and opened the ledger, the candlelight falling across page after page of precise handwriting. The entries chilled him more deeply than anything Catherine had told him. They began in 1800 and continued without pause, documenting gatherings every 6 weeks, sacrifices performed with the rhythm of agricultural cycles, and deaths recorded as though they were experiments rather than murders. At least 37 lives were taken, perhaps more, for the entries reduced human beings to bare descriptions: male 20, no family, child 6 years, poor white, unclaimed, souls erased into ink and parchment. And worse, the records revealed rituals of consumption, describing how pieces of victims were prepared and eaten by the brethren to absorb power. Ezekiel's stomach turned as he read, his hands trembling with rage, until he forced himself to search for what he dreaded most: mention of his family. He found it in an entry dated October 1838, just 3 lines long: purchased family unit from Virginia, woman Sarah, children Benjamin and Ruth, separated from male to demonstrate resolve, sent to Alabama contact, payment received. 3 lines were all his wife and children were worth in this monstrous book. He wanted to burn it all then and there, but Catherine stopped him, insisting they must be patient. If the ledger vanished, the brethren would know immediately. Instead, they worked for hours, copying the most damning entries onto paper Catherine had smuggled into the cellar, focusing on names of current members and the most gruesome sacrifices. Ezekiel recorded victims' details, hoping one day they might be matched with lost lives remembered by someone beyond these walls. The work drained them both, but it also bound them tighter. Catherine's face hardened with each line she wrote, while Ezekiel's fury simmered until his whole body felt like a clenched fist. They were so intent on their work that they did not hear the footsteps descending the stairs until light flared in the outer chamber. Ezekiel froze, his blood running cold as Silas Ruttles appeared in the doorway, flanked by 2 men, with several more shadows waiting behind. He was supposed to be in Charleston for 3 days, yet here he was, eyes gleaming with cold triumph. "I must admit," he said calmly, "I am impressed. I did not think you would find the inner chamber." Catherine rose slowly, placing herself between her father and Ezekiel. Her voice was steady as she accused him of poisoning her for years, of making her weak to silence her memories. Silas did not deny it. He called it necessary, claiming she had seen what no child should, insisting he had done it to preserve everything he built. Catherine's retort was sharp and unflinching, that what she had seen was murder, that no child could misunderstand the sight of a woman being carved open and devoured. Silas's composure cracked slightly at her words, but he recovered quickly, turning his gaze to Ezekiel. He accused him of filling Catherine's head with dangerous ideas, of using her against him. Ezekiel said nothing, calculating the odds, knowing 7 men against him, and Catherine was impossible to overcome. Silas read his thoughts, gesturing for them to be taken upstairs. They were marched into his study and locked in, the heavy oak door bolted from the outside. Catherine immediately revealed that she had hidden the pages they had copied, slipping them inside her dress where Silas had not searched. It was proof that even in capture, they held a fragment of power. But Ezekiel warned grimly that pages would mean nothing if they were both dead. Catherine's eyes sharpened with a cruel sort of calculation. Her father, she said, would not kill her immediately. Blood still tied his hands, and he would look for other ways to resolve this. They heard the arrival of carriages outside, footsteps in the hall, the low hum of voices as the brethren gathered. Finally, the door opened, and they were led back down to the cellar, but now it was transformed. All 13 members were present, seated in a circle, their robes deep crimson in the candlelight. The altar was draped in cloth, the atmosphere thick with ritual gravity. Catherine and Ezekiel were placed in the center as Silas addressed the brethren, declaring that his daughter and her companion had discovered their secrets, seen the ledger, even copied from it. Judge Pelham demanded their immediate execution, but Silas raised his hand and offered another path. He proposed a test. Catherine would be silenced, yes, but Ezekiel could be turned, drawn into their circle as proof that their power extended even to those who hated them most. He offered Ezekiel revenge against Edward Gaines, the Alabama owner who had overseen the deaths of his family. He promised money, resources, everything Ezekiel needed, if only he would prove himself by joining them. If he refused, he and Catherine would die before the night ended. Catherine's whisper carried across the circle like steel, "Do not do it." But Ezekiel, staring at the faces of men who had destroyed so many lives, began to understand that survival would require something more than defiance. The time to choose had come, and in that moment he decided on a path that was neither surrender nor resistance, but something far more dangerous. The cellar was silent except for the flicker of candle flames and the steady hum of men who believed they controlled every outcome, yet Ezekiel knew the balance of power was shifting, even if no one else saw it yet. Silas held out a knife with its leather, apt hilt, telling him that to join them he must take the blade, make the first cut into the bound girl laid upon the altar, and prove his loyalty by choosing cruelty over conscience. The chanting of the brethren filled the room, rhythmic and low, pressing against Ezekiel's ears like waves meant to drown thought. He looked at the girl, young and terrified, her eyes wide with the kind of fear he had seen in every enslaved person torn from their family. In her gaze he saw Sarah, Benjamin, Ruth, and he felt the weight of years of suffering pressing into this one moment. If he killed her, he would lose himself forever. If he refused, he and Catherine would die. Their fight ended before it truly began. Yet hidden beneath those two impossible choices was a third path, one he had been preparing for since the night Silas first proposed his initiation. He stepped forward, took the knife and raised it high, the chanting rising in anticipation, the brethren leaning forward like spectators awaiting proof of their supremacy. Then, with sudden ferocity, he turned not toward the girl, but toward the nearest robed figure, driving the blade deep into the man's throat before anyone could react. Blood sprayed across the altar as the man collapsed, and in that instant chaos shattered the ceremony. Ezekiel moved like a storm, seizing the man's robe and flinging it into the nearest cluster of candles, plunging half the room into darkness. Shouts erupted, men stumbling over one another, and Ezekiel struck again, kicking out at knees, smashing faces with a heavy candle holder, using his rage as both weapon and shield. He was not like them, soft men accustomed to commanding others to do violence. He was forged in fields, hardened by loss, driven by years of buried fury. The girl on the altar scrambled away, freed by a quick slash of his knife, and fled up the cellar stairs screaming for help. Silas, still standing at the head of the altar, tried to command order, his voice rising above the clamor, but the brethren were unprepared for real resistance. Ezekiel's body was a blur, each movement fueled by memory and vengeance, striking down man after man with a precision that came from survival. Yet numbers still pressed against him, 7 of them alive and blocking his path, and he knew that despite his fury, he could not fight them all alone. What none of the brethren realized was that the girl's scream had carried beyond the cellar, carried into the night where Catherine was waiting, for she had never left Cypress Grove. She had spent 3 weeks in hiding among the slave quarters, whispering to the men and women who had lived under her father's cruelty, telling them of the brethren's rituals, of the bodies that vanished into the swamps, of children taken and never seen again. She had given them a plan, a night, a purpose. When the terrified girl burst into the kitchen and into their midst, Catherine knew the time had come. 3 enslaved people armed with tools of labor turned weapons, axes, scythes, hammers, followed her down into the cellar. The brethren never had a chance. They were men of wealth, not fighters, and they found themselves overwhelmed by the rage of those they had tormented for decades. Judge Pelham tried to draw a pistol, but was struck down before he could aim. Reverend Crenshaw pleaded for mercy, only to be silenced forever. Marcus Fanning attempted to flee up the stairs, but was dragged back down into the darkness. Catherine led the charge with fire in her eyes, her voice sharp as she urged them forward, the years of helplessness in her life burning away in one night of unflinching fury. Silas, realizing everything was collapsing around him, seized Catherine by the arm, pressing a knife to her throat, screaming at the room to stop or he would kill her. For a moment, the frenzy paused, the cellar heavy with the weight of his desperation. Catherine, however, did not cower. She looked into her father's eyes with a cold, fearless smile and told him to do it, to end her life if he dared, because he had already lost everything. She reminded him of the years he had spent trying to break her, poisoning her body, convincing her she was insane, silencing her with drugs and lies. He had failed. She remembered everything, and she would die remembering. Her words cut him deeper than the blade in his hand. She drove her elbow back into his ribs, breaking free of his grip just as Ezekiel surged forward, knife flashing, and for the first time Silas faced the man whose family he had destroyed. Their eyes met, one filled with the hollow arrogance of a master, the other blazing with the fury of a father who had lost everything. Silas begged, a pathetic single word, "Please." But Ezekiel's reply was quiet and final, a death sentence carried by years of grief. No mercy, not for you, not ever. And then vengeance was delivered, swift and brutal, as the enslaved people ensured none of the brethren survived that night. The cellar became a graveyard of men who had once believed themselves untouchable, their bodies broken not by courts or laws, but by the very people they had thought powerless. When silence finally returned, the only sound left was the crackle of breath and the faint dripping of blood on the dirt floor. Catherine stood amid the carnage, trembling not with fear, but with the release of 16 years of rage, and Ezekiel stood beside her, battered but alive, his eyes scanning the devastation with the weight of what had been done. They both knew that nothing would ever be the same, that they had crossed a line from which there was no return, and that before dawn, Cypress Grove would no longer exist in the same world it had once ruled. The cellar reeked of smoke and blood, and as the bodies of the brethren lay strewn across the floor, Catherine and Ezekiel stood at the center of it all, knowing the night was not yet finished, because what had been done could not remain hidden without consequence. Catherine's eyes burned with grim determination as she told Ezekiel that everything had to be destroyed. Every body, every robe, every paper, every trace of the rituals that had consumed Cypress Grove. Ezekiel argued at first, pointing out that the ledger and the journals could be used as proof, that they could expose what these men had done to the world. But Catherine shook her head with a bitter laugh. Who would believe them, she asked, when she had only just escaped the label of madness, and when he was a black man still counted as property in the eyes of the law? No judge or governor would condemn their peers based on the testimony of people like them. To take that ledger to the authorities would not bring justice, it would bring death to both of them. The only justice possible was the kind they had already delivered, and the only survival possible was to erase the truth from the eyes of the world. Her reasoning was sharp and cold, and Ezekiel knew she was right. They began the grim work immediately. The enslaved people who had fought alongside them departed silently into the night, returning to their plantations and cabins with the unspoken oath that nothing had happened, that they had seen nothing, because to speak would mean certain death. Catherine and Ezekiel stayed behind, piling wood, pouring oil across the cellar floor, stacking the journals, the ledger, the robes, and even the altar itself into a pyre of evidence. Before setting the fire, Ezekiel opened the ledger one last time and found the entry about his family. Those 3 short lines that had cost him everything. With careful hands, he tore the pages free and folded them against his chest, whispering Sarah, Benjamin, Ruth, as though speaking their names could tether their memory against the forgetting the world demanded. Catherine nodded in approval, saying that even if everything else burned, those names must live on. Then she held a candle to the oil-soaked wood, and within moments flames erupted, crawling up the walls, consuming the robes and papers, blackening the beams overhead. The cellar became a furnace, the heat pressing against them as they fled up the stairs and into the night air, watching from the yard as Cypress Grove began to burn. Fire spread quickly through the house, devouring the wooden timbers, the curtains, the furniture, until the plantation itself became a beacon in the darkness, its smoke curling upward like the soul of a dying beast. They stood side by side in the orange glow, Catherine trembling with exhaustion but smiling grimly, Ezekiel clutching the folded pages of his family as though they were relics. They knew people would come, neighbors and overseers from nearby plantations, drawn by the flames, but they also knew the story they would tell. A tragic accident, a candle knocked over in the cellar during a gathering of gentlemen, a fire that spread too quickly to contain, trapping everyone. Below, by dawn, Cypress Grove would be reduced to ashes, and by the time the county's whispers settled, the legend would be fixed. 13 prominent men, lost to misfortune, mourned as martyrs of society rather than exposed as monsters. Catherine and Ezekiel had scripted their own disappearance as well. She told him she would use money stolen from her father's accounts to vanish into the north, perhaps to Philadelphia, where she could begin again in anonymity, though she confessed she had no desire to live long with the memories she carried. Ezekiel promised to move westward, to find places where enslaved people escaped and built new lives, to help others slip from chains, and perhaps to form a network that would grow beyond him. They both understood they would never see each other again, yet they parted with an unspoken bond, forged in fire and sealed in vengeance. The enslaved who had fought with them scattered into silence. Some sold off in the following months as Cypress Grove's land and remnants were liquidated, others carrying whispers of the night justice had come. Catherine turned north, Ezekiel west, and as the plantation collapsed into ruin behind them, history reshaped itself. The official record would tell of a tragic fire that consumed men of importance and their unfortunate daughter, remembered with eulogies and sorrow, while the truth became something else entirely, a story carried in whispers through slave quarters, in late-night tales told by firelight of night masters burned, of a woman and a man who rose against monsters and won. Years later, ruins of the plantation would be demolished, but the legend refused to die, transforming into myth, a reminder that cruelty has consequences, even if history tries to bury it. And though authorities never saw the ledger, though official papers insisted nothing but an accident had occurred, somewhere out in the world Ezekiel carried the names of his family, written in the brethren's own hand, proof that what had been lost would never be forgotten. For Catherine, the vow was different but no less enduring. She would record her truth, coded and hidden so it might survive until a future where it could be read without fear, a testimony waiting in silence for the day the world was ready to hear it. Together in that burning night, they proved that even the powerless could wield a power greater than terror, the power of memory, of witness, of refusing to be silenced. The years that followed the burning of Cypress Grove were restless ones, shaped not by peace but by the scars of memory, as Catherine and Ezekiel moved along the separate paths they had chosen on that night of fire, each haunted by what they had done and what they had lost. Catherine traveled north under a false name, slipping through towns and cities with forged papers and the small fortune she had carried away from her father's accounts, until she settled briefly in Philadelphia, where the bustle of free black communities and abolitionist networks made her feel both hidden and exposed at once. She lodged in small boarding houses, never staying too long, always wary that whispers of her true identity might spread, because the fire at Cypress Grove had not gone unnoticed by the world. Southern papers published mournful accounts of the 13 great men who perished in the blaze, praising their contributions to society, their generosity, their refinement, while disguising the truth beneath layers of reverent lies. Silas Ruddled was remembered as a pillar of his community, mourned by ministers and planters who never questioned why his daughter's body was never found in the ashes. Catherine read those obituaries with cold fury, clipping some of them and pasting them into a hidden notebook where she scrawled the truth in margins, a secret chronicle of hypocrisy. She lived quietly, posing as a widow, until her health began to collapse again under the weight of her memories and the restless nights filled with visions of blood and fire. She often dreamed of the cellar, of her father's eyes, of the knife at her throat, and she woke shaking, clutching the vial of laudanum she still carried, though she no longer drank from it, as though keeping the poison close reminded her she had survived it. Ezekiel, meanwhile, moved westward through Tennessee, Kentucky, and Ohio, carrying with him not just the pages of the ledger that bore his family's names, but also the skills and stories he shared with others seeking freedom. He attached himself to networks of abolitionists, some formal, some hidden, guiding families along river routes, teaching them how to vanish from patrols, how to build shelters in caves and hollow trees, how to move by starlight. He never spoke openly of what had happened at Cypress Grove, but sometimes in the quiet of a cabin by firelight, he would whisper to a frightened man or woman that masters could fall, that there were nights when the oppressors burned, and those stories gave courage to people who had lived too long in fear. His reputation grew not as a leader but as a shadow, someone who appeared when needed and disappeared when the danger passed. He bore scars from those years, wounds from patrolmen and slave catchers, but he pressed on, driven by the unyielding vow he had made at the altar to his wife and children, that they would not be forgotten, that their lives would echo through the freedom of others. Yet even as he helped others escape, the weight of vengeance never left him. Sometimes when he closed his eyes, he saw the face of Silas in that final moment, pleading, broken, and he felt not triumph but a hollow ache that no death could ever truly fill. Catherine and Ezekiel's paths nearly crossed once in New York, where she attended a small abolitionist meeting under her false identity, listening as freedmen and allies spoke about the growing divide between North and South. A tall, broad-shouldered man with scars on his hands spoke briefly in the back of the hall, warning of the brutality still festering in the South, and Catherine felt her chest tighten, certain for a moment that it was him, that Ezekiel had found his way to the same place. But before she could push through the crowd, he had vanished into the night like a shadow, leaving her to wonder, if she had only imagined it. Over time, her journals grew heavier, filled with coded entries about Cypress Grove, about the Brethren, about every whisper of corruption she encountered in northern cities where Southern money still bought influence. She began to realize that while the Brethren of Colleton County had burned, other circles survived, their rituals continuing in other states, their secrecy protecting them. The thought consumed her, and she feared that destroying one nest of monsters had not ended the sickness, but merely cut off one of its limbs. She grew obsessed with finding connections, marking names, tracing threads of influence, even as her health weakened. She no longer sought vengeance. She had tasted enough of blood, but she sought truth, some record that might outlive her, some testimony that the world could not bury so easily. Ezekiel, too, began to see the same pattern. In letters whispered through abolitionist circles, he heard of strange gatherings in Georgia, in Louisiana, where planters spoke of old rites, of harvest sacrifices whispered in hushed tones. He recognized the echo of the Brethren, and though rage urged him to hunt them, age and exhaustion tempered his fire. Instead, he poured his strength into saving others, believing that the best answer to such cruelty was to deny it victims, to take people out of its reach. Still, he kept the torn pages of the ledger with him always, tucked into a wooden box he carved himself, inscribed with the names Sarah, Benjamin, Ruth, so that even when he died, someone might know who they had been and why he had fought. Both Catherine and Ezekiel lived with ghosts, haunted not by regret but by the understanding that their vengeance had not ended the cycle, only interrupted it. And yet in their solitude they each found a kind of grim satisfaction. They had broken one circle of power, they had given terror back to the men who had built their world on blood, and they had proven, if only for one night, that the powerless could burn the powerful to ash. By the time decade turned and the 1840s deepened, both Catherine and Ezekiel had become phantoms in their own ways, living lives that appeared ordinary to those around them, but carrying within the extraordinary burden of the night Cypress Grove burned. Catherine, aging faster than her years, shifted often from town to town across the Northeast, her notebooks growing heavier, her handwriting sometimes steady, sometimes frantic, as she documented not only her memories but also the hints she continued to uncover about the Brethren's wider network. She met men in Boston drawing rooms who spoke of Southern investments with peculiar secrecy, and she marked their names. She attended church sermons in New Haven where visiting ministers carried a strange intensity in their language, and she scribbled in the margins of her journal that she recognized the cadence of ritual chants. She heard whispers among abolitionists about wealthy patrons who funded colonization, efforts to send freedmen back to Africa, and she suspected some of these men were not motivated by philanthropy but by the same hunger for blood-soaked control she had seen at her father's gatherings. Though she appeared fragile, at times trembling with the effort of daily life, her mind sharpened like a blade honed on grief. Yet her isolation deepened, for she trusted almost no one, fearing that even allies might dismiss her as unstable, just as Sela's once had. Her only solace came from her secret writing, the careful codes she invented to hide names and events in layered ciphers, believing one day someone might decipher them and finally bring the truth into daylight. Ezekiel, meanwhile, carried his fire westward into lands where new plantations devoured territories recently seized by force and treaty, and he saw with his own eyes how slavery expanded like a contagion, moving with settlers who carved fields out of native forests. He joined small groups of abolitionist preachers, blacksmiths, and free black farmers, not as a leader but as a guide, always in the shadows, teaching routes, digging false graves to hide people during searches, fashioning signals with lanterns that could lead families across rivers by night. The people he saved often never knew his name, but they whispered of a tall man with quiet eyes who carried stories of vengeance like firewood, passing them from one heart to another. Sometimes he sat alone by rivers, the folded pages of the ledger pressed in his palm, reading those 3 lines about Sarah, Benjamin, and Ruth until his chest ached. He told himself that every family he guided to freedom was a prayer offered to them, that each child who crossed safely into the north was a piece of Benjamin and Ruth carried onward. Each woman who held her children close was Sarah's spirit preserved. Yet even as he saved others, he too saw signs of the Brethren's persistence. In Louisiana, he heard of planter societies gathering in secret. In Mississippi, he saw the strange carvings on an altar stone brought from Europe. In Arkansas, he met a man who whispered drunkenly about rituals of blood and harvest, held far from the eyes of the law. Ezekiel began to wonder if the Brethren were not a single circle but many, a pattern repeating across states, each cell believing itself unique while tied by the same hunger. He carried this suspicion like a stone in his chest, but he told no one, for to speak would only endanger the fragile network of escape routes he worked to build. Meanwhile, Catherine's health faltered more with each year. She coughed blood into her handkerchiefs. Her bones ached, and her body felt as though poisoned still lingered in her veins. But her mind did not yield. She continued to write, and in her darkest hours, she returned to the vow she had made with Ezekiel, that when her strength failed, she would not be forced to linger, that death would be her choice, not the world's. She began drafting her final words, not as confession but as testimony, a document coded so intricately that she believed no one in her own time could read it. Yet perhaps in another century someone would. Her greatest fear was not death but silence, and she fought against that by filling page after page. Ezekiel, for his part, grew older but not slower, his body scarred yet unbroken. He worked through the 1840s and 1850s, quietly assisting those who spoke of something called the Underground Railroad, though he never sought recognition. He was a man who moved like smoke, who appeared when needed, who carried with him the memory of Cypress Grove like a secret weapon. And though he never saw Catherine again, he sometimes imagined her still writing, still plotting, still burning with the same fury that had lit her eyes in the cellar. Both of them knew they could never truly destroy the sickness of the Brethren, but both had committed to the only power they possessed, memory and resistance. In a world that insisted on forgetting, they became its keepers, bearing witness through scars, stories, and silence, proof that even in an age of cruelty, defiance could survive in the shadows. By the time the 1850s drew near, Catherine lived as a woman out of time, her body failing though her mind refused to surrender, and Ezekiel endured as a shadow moving through the contested borders of freedom and bondage, both of them tethered by the single night when fire consumed Cypress Grove. Catherine, now in her mid-30s but aged by sickness into the appearance of a woman 20 years older, stayed mostly in Boston, hidden under the guise of a widow with fading health. She rented a small upper room near the wharves where the sea air mixed with coal smoke. And in that dim light she filled more notebooks, layering codes upon codes, chronicling not only the Brethren she had witnessed, but the others she had come to suspect. She wrote of names whispered in Charleston parlors, in Savannah plantations, in New York banks where Southern money flowed like poisoned water, and she began to see a web larger than even she had feared, one that stretched across the nation, quietly feeding on secrecy and power. Each entry carried urgency, as if she believed time itself was running out, and in her weaker moments she pressed a trembling hand against the pages, whispering that someone, someday, must read them. She rarely ventured out, except to hear abolitionist speakers in crowded halls, her veil hiding the cough that rattled in her chest. But those speeches stirred something fragile in her, hope, though quickly drowned by cynicism, because she knew too much of what the world was willing to ignore. She longed sometimes for Ezekiel, not in romance but in recognition, the comfort of someone who had seen what she had seen, who would not dismiss her as delusional. Yet he was a ghost to her, gone into the territories, and she told herself that perhaps it was better that way, for they were bound together not by peace, but by blood and vengeance. Ezekiel, meanwhile, carved his path west and north, working more deliberately within the channels that would later be called the Underground Railroad. He guided families from Kentucky across the Ohio River, hid men in false, bottomed wagons bound for Indiana, and taught women how to sew maps into quilts that could guide others by symbols. He was never the man in front of the crowd, never the one history would record. But without him, many would not have lived to tell their stories. At night, when silence settled over the barns and caves where fugitives rested, he would sometimes pull out the folded ledger pages and trace his fingers over the names of Sarah, Benjamin, and Ruth, his voice low as he told frightened children stories of them, not as martyrs, but as proof that love endured even when torn apart. Those stories became light for others, and though they did not erase his grief, they gave it purpose. Yet even as he saved lives, shadows lengthened. In Missouri, he overheard a planter boasting of rites of harvest. That sounded too familiar. In Louisiana, he saw the same carved symbols from Cypress Grove etched into a barn door. He realized then that the brethren had not died with Silas and his circle. They had multiplied, grown quieter, more secret, but still alive. He did not chase them, for he knew to do so would be to invite his own death, but he carried the knowledge like poison, knowing Catherine had been right that the sickness spread beyond their reach. The decade pressed on, and the nation tore itself toward conflict, whispers of war becoming louder each year, and in that storm both Catherine and Ezekiel remained watchers on the edge, their lives marked not by triumph, but by endurance. Catherine's notebooks grew more desperate, her entries interspersed with prayers for release, and she began to prepare her final act, not of vengeance but of testimony, ensuring her words would outlast her body. She hid her journals in walls, beneath floorboards, in trunks labeled with false names, scattering them like seeds that might one day grow. Ezekiel aged but did not slow, his body scarred, his hair graying, yet still he walked with the strength of a man driven by vow, still he guided, still he fought in silence. By 1855, Catherine's body finally betrayed her. Fever consumed her, her lungs filled with blood, and one winter night she wrote her last entry, that she remembered everything, that memory itself was resistance, and that even if the world chose silence, she would not. She passed quietly, her journal sealed, her secrets waiting. Ezekiel never learned of her death, only that the woman he once called ally had vanished into history as completely as if she had been a ghost. Yet he carried her in the unspoken part of his soul, the place where memory and vengeance blurred into one. And as the nation stumbled closer to war, he remained ready, a man who knew that when the fire finally came again, it would not be contained to one plantation, but would spread across the whole land. In the final years before the great rupture of war, Ezekiel lived as both a shadow and a seed, a man whose name would not be written in ledgers of history, but whose footsteps carried through the veins of those who sought freedom. And it was in this quiet, unrecorded labor that his story reached its closing. By the late 1850s, he had moved steadily northward, no longer darting from plantation to plantation, but anchoring himself in Ohio, near the routes where countless fugitives crossed the river toward freedom. He built a modest cabin on the edge of the woods, carved with his own hands, its walls lined with secret compartments where food, clothing, and tools for escape could be hidden. By day he worked as a carpenter for small wages, mending wagons and fences, but by night he guided, planned, whispered, always with the same fire that had begun at Cypress Grove, a fire that could never be extinguished because it was fed by the memory of those he had lost. He had grown gray now, his hair silvered, his body stiffened by age and scars, but his presence still carried the unshakable steadiness of a man who had survived horrors and turned them into purpose. Sometimes, when the woods were still, he would sit alone by his hearth, the folded pages of the ledger still pressed inside the wooden box he had carried for decades, and he would read them not with fury, but with a quiet grief that had softened with time. He no longer dreamed of vengeance because he had delivered it long ago, but he dreamed of Sarah's smile, of Benjamin's laugh, of Ruth's small hand in his. In those moments he allowed himself tears, not as weakness but as proof that he was still human despite everything the world had tried to take from him. Catherine's memory too lingered, not as a haunting but as a voice in the dark, urging him never to forget, never to let silence win, and though he never knew where her journals lay, he trusted that she had scattered them wisely, that somewhere her testimony waited like a bomb of truth for future to discover. And so the years passed, each season marked by new families crossing his threshold, each child's laughter a small thread stitched into the wound of his heart. When the war finally came, Ezekiel was an old man, too weary to fight but strong enough to serve as guide and shelter. Soldiers sometimes passed near his cabin, and he told them nothing of who he was, only that he had seen enough blood in one lifetime. By 1863, when the Emancipation Proclamation was issued, Ezekiel sat by his fire and listened to the words read aloud in a crowded church, his eyes wet, though he knew freedom declared on paper was not freedom yet in truth. Still, he whispered Sarah, Benjamin, Ruth, and allowed himself to believe that in some way their chains had been broken too. He died quietly in the winter of 1865, the war ending around him, the world reshaping itself. Neighbors found him seated in his chair by the fire, the wooden box on his lap, his hands folded over it, as though guarding the names until the very last breath. They buried him in a small graveyard, unmarked, just another old man gone, yet the stories he had passed into the ears of those who fled lived on, retold in cabins, in whispers, in the songs of children who had never known slavery but inherited its memory. Catherine's journals too waited, hidden in walls and trunks, not to be discovered until generations later when time had softened the fear that had once demanded silence. Together, their legacies endured not in statues or books but in memory, the memory of fire that consumed a house of monsters, the memory of a woman who refused to be silenced, the memory of a man who turned grief into freedom for others. History did not name them, but the people did, carrying their truth forward in the only way truth survives, by telling it again and again until it becomes more than myth, until it becomes warning, until it becomes hope. And so the story of Cypress Grove did not end in ash. It lived in the shadows, in the whispered testimony of those who remembered, proof that even the smallest defiance, even the most hidden act of resistance, can echo louder than all the lies the powerful tell.